How's it going, guys? John the Basic Expert here, and this is the first video in a series that I said I was going to do, and might as well just get to it, you know? We're going to talk about West End games Star Wars D6 for the next foreseeable future. You know, I've done past deep dives into games, and people seem to really like those. I like doing them because I like really looking at a game system, at its mechanics, its rules, as someone who's designed his own games as well, and I want to use that information, that knowledge to better myself as a designer and as a game master, because I think oftentimes there's this mistake made by lots of different people, and I get it, and it's fine, but to me it's a mistake for myself, I guess I should say, and that they adhere to only one system, right? They look at only one system and they don't they ignore all the others. They ignore all the other games out there, and there's a lot of good stuff out there, and oftentimes when people limit themselves to just BX or just 5th edition, they're missing out on a lot of other fun games that could be played that are out there, and maybe some of those ideas, even though it's a different game system, some of the assumptions and the core ideas of that game system can be brought into their favorite game and be made and make it better. Or if they're looking to design their own games or their own adventures, their own settings, all of these things can help you from other games, influence you, and improve the game that you're currently running. So that's part of why I wanted to do these deep dives. First, I did Basic Fantasy mostly because Basic Fantasy is just a really good game. It's free, and if you're looking to get into the OSR, if you're looking to get that old school feel and flavor, it is a very low investment to get into that game. So check out those videos. They're very popular, as well as Traveler. I talked about Classic Traveler in particular, the very first edition of Traveler. We went through it. I made some mistakes, but those of you out there that will watch, I think, have been very kind and generous to me in those videos for the mistakes that I made as I went through the rules, because you know, they're not I just made mistakes. I'm not an expert on Classic Traveler. I run it. And I'm not an expert, but I run it, and I really love that game, and it's a sci-fi game that definitely needs a lot of love and attention, I think. There's newer editions of Traveler out there, but there's something special about Classic Traveler. So make sure you check those out as well. This time, we're kind of doing a little bit of both, because I can kind of consider Star Wars to be a bit of fantasy and sci-fi mixed together. It's space opera, right? There's no real hard sci-fi in this. It's very different from, say, Classic Traveler, where there's very hard sci-fi information that is in there, science. It feels realistic and grounded and real. And not that Star Wars D6 doesn't feel real, it feels like Star Wars, which is sort of this space fantasy. It's fantasy in space. It's like you have space wizards, right? So it has a different feel. So it's kind of this in-between point, I think, between between Basic Fantasy or BX D&D, which is kind of my bread and butter, right? And sci-fi, which I love sci-fi, but I don't run as many sci-fi games as I would really like to. So this will be a fun thing to cover. Before we get too far in the video, I want to talk about the channel sponsor, Neckbeardia. Website link will be in the video description. There might be a little thing popping up here or over here. They specialize in minis and miniatures. They're a UK-based store, and you can order some very high-quality miniatures from there. If you use my code TBE10 at checkout, you'll save 10%, and you help support the channel as well. So please make sure to check that out. They have a great YouTube channel, too. Link will be in the video description to their channel as well. So check out Neckbeardia. Check out their store. They generally, I think, average about 4.6 stars out of 5 on their store. So people like the products they make. I highly suggest you check them out and you support the channel and get some cool miniatures for yourself as well. So let's talk about, in this video, we're not going to really dive into game mechanics. We're not going to really dive into any of that stuff just yet. I want to do something a little different than what I've done in the previous 2 deep dives, and I want to talk about the company and the history of the game before we even talk about the game itself, because I think context is important, and I kind of wish I had done this a little more with Traveler, as that is also a very interesting story as to how Traveler came about from Game Designers Workshop, and Basic Fantasy as well. But I didn't do that. We just dived right into the mechanics. This is how you make a character. This is how the game is played, and I kind of want to take my time with this one, because I think the West End games company story is an interesting story, and it's the how this game came to be is, to me, kind of interesting, and its influence that it's had, not just in the role-playing game hobby, but in the wider world of Star Wars, is you have to talk about that. West End Games was started by Scott Palter. He was a member of the New York State Bar, and he had some financial connections working at his family's law firm where he could start his own company. And so he started West End Games, named after a bar where they first sort of sealed a deal on starting this company called the West End Bar. West End Games was then started. And initially it was a war games company, and they sort of moved over board games and war games. And Palter hired Ken Ralston, Eric Goldberg, and Greg Kostakayan, hopefully I'm saying their names right, as game designers. And these designers would go on to design some very iconic games, such as the first one they did was Bug-Eyed Monsters by Kostakayan. They would do Paranoia and a few other games, but obviously most of all, West End Games Star Wars D6. And Paranoia was like the real groundbreaking game for them. And Paranoia is actually, you can get the Mongoose Publishing version is the latest version that is out currently. Mongoose Publishing, the publishers of Traveler, the current edition of Traveler, most recent edition of Traveler, they are the ones that publish the current version of Paranoia. But they originally created this system, this D6 system, and it would go on to be used in the Ghostbusters role-playing game, which also used this D6 system. And this Ghostbusters game, I mean, what made West End Games so interesting was they got all these licenses to very popular intellectual properties of the 80s, Ghostbusters and Star Wars as an example. And I think they were able to do it because, coming from a war game background, they had some pretty high standards as far as quality is concerned, very similar to TSR. And so they were actually able to compete with TSR on pretty big levels in regards to that. So in 1987, they received the rights to Star Wars. I heard it on one of the chats that it almost went to GURPS. It was almost, I guess, going to go to Steve Jackson Games. But in the end, it went to West End Games. And West End Games, I think, did quite a good job on this game. I do think that it's not just hype for this game and undue nostalgia. One thing I really appreciate in reading West End Games Star Wars D6 is how you read it and it's written with love. Like, this is written by people that clearly know and love Star Wars. And so much so that they created a lot of lore for the expanded universe, author after author, comic book after comic book author, or video game designer, anything where the expanded universe was involved. Many of them credit the Blue Source book, which was the kind of companion book to the rule book that had a lot of races and lore and lots of stuff that West End Games honestly just made up, was used to kind of flesh out that expanded universe. And a lot of it even exists to today. Yes, Disney has sort of, I think, mistakenly reset the Star Wars universe as far as lore is concerned by expunging the expanded universe and calling it Legends or whatever it is now. But at the time, when I was growing up, the expanded universe was canon in our minds. I don't know if it officially ever was explained to be canon, but in my mind, it was canon. And so, I mean, that alone is enough of a accolade for this game and the fine folks at West End Games that made this to be quite an achievement, to say the least. That, as influential as the original trilogy is, I would almost say to a degree that the ideas that are in the source book and the ideas that are in the West End Games Star Wars game, role-playing game, are fundamental to what we know of as Star Wars today, right? And again, they were able to somewhat compete with TSR. I've heard it said that this game was the second most played game right after Dungeons and Dragons at the time. This game, Star Wars D6 came out in 1987, and from what I hear, it was the second most played game. And I think this is for a couple different reasons. First of all, it's Star Wars, and that's a huge IP. Star Wars has always been huge. It's always been big, and up until recently, always been well loved by most people. It's been a cultural phenomenon. But I think that contributes to it being so successful, as it's such an iconic intellectual property. It's the kind of intellectual property that within the hobby could actually compete with Dungeons and Dragons and what TSR was doing. Secondly, I think, the Satanic Panic was in full swing, and I hear a lot of people say that they were not allowed to play Dungeons and Dragons. They wanted to play D&D. They wanted to play original Dungeons and Dragons. They wanted to play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They wanted to play BX, but their parents wouldn't let them because of the Satanic Panic, and they were worried about summoning demons and all that whole nonsense, But I do hear that a lot of people played other games. Well, they couldn't get their hands on D&D, but they could play other games. So some of those games might have been Rifts. But I think Star Wars was always a safe bet, right? Like, I grew up at the tail end of the Satanic Panic in a very evangelical home, and I was not allowed to watch certain things. I most certainly was not allowed to play D&D. But because Star Wars was so iconic, and my parents had seen it and enjoyed it, they knew there was nothing bad in it. There was nothing wrong in it. It wasn't evil, that it was a story of good versus evil, that it was okay for me to watch, despite the very evangelical, harsh environment that my brothers and I grew up in. So just knowing that, like, I could see how some parents probably would allow their children, despite the Satanic Panic going on, being like, yeah, you can't play D&D, but sure, we'll let you play the Star Wars game, because Star Wars is fine. Like, we know it's just fake, it's Jedi and stuff like that. We're familiar with it. We're not familiar with D&D because that's something else and something different that's sort of very niche, even though how big it is. Like, we as parents don't understand it, but we understand Star Wars. So there's that. An interesting little tidbit too, I forgot to mention, with how iconic the source book is that doing some research on this, Lucasfilm actually considered the Blue Source book to be canon, really. And when Timothy Zahn, who was hired to write what would become the Thrawn trilogy, he was sent a box of West End Games role-playing game books as a reference for his book as to what the wider lore of the Star Wars universe is. Because again, at the time, like, it wasn't, I think we live in such an interesting time now as far as media is concerned, where everything has to be part of this interconnected universe. And to a degree, I think Star Wars is maybe the first thing to actually really do that. Like, that's what everyone is trying to do. And the expanded universe was sort of the proto, everything is in a universe and interconnected sort of storyline. And all of it traces back to these books, which is super fascinating and super interesting. So these games sold really well, which was surprising to West End Games, because Star Wars, these came out in 87. Obviously, Return of the Jedi came out in 83, so it'd been, 4 or 5 years since the last film came out. And so Star Wars was still in our consciousness. Obviously, people still love Star Wars, but, it wasn't the hottest new thing at the time. But I'm not surprised by it, because as a kid, like, I didn't grow up at a time where I could see Star Wars in the theater. I saw on the original versions on VHS as a kid, because I'm about as old as this game is. So that can give you some reference for those of you watching out there. I'm as old as West End Games Star Wars D6. We both were born in the same year. So I saw it on I saw it on VHS, and I loved it. And I think there's a lot of kids that were the same way. They might have not been quite old enough. And those that love Star Wars love Star Wars. Like, even though I'm so cynical of Disney Star Wars these days, and I'm quite honestly not that interested in it anymore, I still love Star Wars. Those original 3 films are my favorites, right? Like, they're part of my childhood. There is nostalgia. I can't deny that there's nostalgia that does cloud our memories as to how good these films actually maybe are. I think they are legitimately good films, but then stacking nostalgia on top of that, you sort of elevate it to something much greater than maybe what it initially was. But that's okay. That's what happens. And I think the original Star Wars films earn that high place on a pedestal as far as nostalgia is concerned. I've been watching them with my daughter a little bit because she loves C-3PO and she loves R2-D2, and so we're watching, and we were just watching the original Star Wars film, and what's called A New Hope now, and I was just watching it, I'm like, God, it just looks so good. The world around it looks so good. Like it's immersive. The film is itself immersive. You're just thrown in and you experience this sort of space opera world that is lived in and gritty and dirty. And the West End Games books feel like that. You read it and they feel like that sort of world. They feel like the Star Wars world. And I think, again, because it's written by people that love Star Wars, and it wasn't written in a cynical manner, so to speak, right? Like, it wasn't written like, let's just grab money. Like, sure, it was a popular IP to have, and I'm sure money was at the forefront of their mind as well, but it was tempered with, we want to make money, and we really love Star Wars too. This is a match made in heaven, and I think that is why this game has been so successful, and probably would have still been successful if not for the financial issues of West End Games to come later down the line. So let's talk about, there's other games that have come about from West End Games. They made Torg, they made a Hercules and Xena role-playing game. That was actually one of the last games to come out before they went under, which we'll get to in a minute here. But the downfall of West End Games, and by default then Star Wars D6, was they had a parent company called Bucci Retail. BUCCI Retail. They were a shoe importer. It was the parent company of the group. Again, remember I said that Scott Poulter, had used some financial connections within his family in order to fund this, and this company, this shoe import company, was part of that. When this shoe import company went under, obviously that meant West End Games was in trouble as well. Poulter tried to file Chapter 11, but that's to reorganize the company's finances. But this caused some more court issues, and from what I understand, there might have been some sketchy money issues involved as well. Regardless, West End Games went under because of shoes. Because of imported shoes. West End Games could not continue to exist, and that meant no more Star Wars games. And by that point, I think like 150 source books, 150 like additional adventures and stories were written within the West End Games Star Wars role-playing game, which is quite impressive. There was 2 editions. There was the first edition, which we're going to be covering, which is often considered the best, and then the second, and then there was like a sort of revised and expanded second edition. We're not going to really talk about those. Most people seem to really love this first edition, which seems to be the case with a lot of different games, but we're going to just focus on first edition. But the company went under. Obviously, that means West End Games loses the Star Wars license, which would go to Wizards of the Coast, unfortunately, the destroyer of intellectual properties. And obviously, we would get the Star Wars D20 game, which I know other people love as well. And to be fair, I hear people say West End Games Star Wars D6 is good for original trilogy era play, and the D20 Star Wars is good for Clone Wars prequel trilogy games, which I could see that, but kind of like I'm not a fan of just shoehorning every setting into a single system. It's kind of my gripe with the Year Zero engine and Free League, as well as a few other game designers and companies that just want to make everything within the system that they know really well. And for me, it's almost like, well, if you're just going to shoehorn everything into D&D, everything's just going to feel like D&D. I am of the mind that system and setting is kind of important with one another. And you could make the argument that West End Games did the same thing. Their D6 system was in everything. It was like ubiquitous with what they were doing, and it was used in a lot of different IPs and everything. But it was one of those things, I think, too, where the cinematic feel of the West End Games D6 system combined with Star Wars was just a perfect match, right? It was just a perfect marriage of system and setting. And so I think that's why for me personally, I'll let it slide because it works really well. The D6 system, again, we'll get into more detail about it, but it is definitely more of a cinematic kind of game. It is not like a dungeon crawl game. Don't go in with that expectation. It's not even close in feel and tone and anything like that to BX or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, anything like that. It feels like its own game, which is, again, very cinematic. But yeah, West End Games went under. WotC would take the rights of Star Wars. They had it until 2010, I think, when they let the license lapse. And the current license holder is Fantasy Flight Games, who has made their own Star Wars game and system, which I'm not the biggest fan of. I'm not a fan of specialty dice in games. I think that that's just an atrocious game design choice. So that, for that reason alone, has kept me from picking up their version of the Star Wars game. I hear people love it. People have told me it's great. I hate specialty dice special to a game. I think that's stupid. You don't need to do that to design a game. It just feels gimmicky to get people to buy dice, and I already own a whole box of dice back there. Like, I don't need to buy more specialty dice for a very specific game. And I don't like doing conversions either, so I hate that. But that's the history of Star Wars and role-playing games, and a little bit about West End Games as a company. Again, kind of sad that West End Games, good designers, they made good games, went under because of shoes, because of imported shoes, but that's the world of business. And, you know, sometimes interesting, weird stuff like that happens. Like, who would have thought shoes would be the downfall of a role-playing game company, design company, and publisher? So going forward, we're going to go through the West End Games First Edition. We'll go through the core rules, and we'll probably go through the source book as well, because the source book is very interesting and fascinating. We might skim through the source book because it's more like setting information. There's some spaceships and stuff. We'll cover the relevant stuff, but we'll definitely go through all of the core rulebook. We'll have a good time talking about that. We'll go through how you make a character, kind of the typical stuff that I've done in the past as far as these deep dive videos are concerned. So I hope that sounds interesting to you. I hope you're willing to join me as we go through this, and it should be a good time. I don't know how many videos this is going to be. I never know when I start these sorts of deep dives, but we just kind of go page by page or section by section and talk about it. And that's what we're going to do with West End Games Star Wars D6. So tell me in the comments about your experiences with Star Wars D6. Do you like it? Do you love it? I'm going to be of the mind that 99% of my viewers out there are going to say they love this game, which is completely understandable. You should love this game, I think. And the hard part is that this is a hard game to get your hands on. There was the reprint from Fantasy Flight Games a while back, but even those reprints go for quite a bit of money, and finding original versions is very hard to find on eBay, especially as Star Wars has become more and more popular and people want to play this game. This game's kind of, for me, there was a mysteriousness to this game before I was able to get my hands on it, and there was this like mystique to it because people talk about it, but you can't get your hands on it, right? To me, it's almost more mysterious. It was almost more mysterious than AD&D First Edition when I started getting into role-playing games, because I always loved Star Wars. So I'm excited for this game to talk about it. It'll be fun. I hope it gets you interested in a really good game from an era when pop culture wasn't so cynical, and it was there to please the fans and written by people that loved the material and with love and care. So that's what I'm excited to talk about, like cool, positive things in fandoms and in genres that maybe currently aren't doing so hot in both the fandom and in the content that's being made for that intellectual property as well, like in Star Wars. So we're going to shoot back in time going forward, talk about this game, and have a good time doing so. So please stick around. Please tune in. I don't know how often these videos are going to come out. I'm going to try and be very much more diligent and better at presenting these games than in this game than I did in even Traveler or Basic Fantasy. I'm trying to up my game with every one of these that I do and get better and better at these. So yeah, that is the introduction to West End Games Star Wars D6. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you like what I do, please consider you can join here on YouTube to support the channel. You can join on my Guilded server. Link is in the Linktree link below, or you can join my Subscribe Star as well. Link is in the Linktree link below as well. different tiers get different bonuses. You get dungeon maps at the lowest tier, an adventure a month at the middle tier, and when I release something big like Atomic Punk or anything like that, you get that for free or for usually much more lowered cost at the higher tier. And I do not cycle anything out. You join up, you get access to everything. I'm probably not the best business decision, but I think that I don't know. I want to be generous with what I'm doing, and I'm super grateful for people that want to support my channel and what I do, so I don't cycle stuff out. So, if someone wants to take advantage of that, they can take advantage of that. I'm a firm believer there's good people out there, and if they like what I do, they're gonna support and tell other people about my channel as well. So, like, subscribe, share, and until the next video, we'll talk about more Star Wars. We'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.